During Thanksgiving, my father announced that they weren't going to babysit my kids anymore. I said, "Seriously?" Then I stopped working on repairs in their house and left. The next day, my phone exploded. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time for family, for good food, for a break from everything. Instead, it turned into a disaster. We were all gathered at my parents' new house, the one I had spent the last 2 months fixing up for them. They had asked me to do it, and I had agreed. New floors, plumbing repairs, repainting, electrical work. Every free hour I had, I was there, covered in dust and sweat, making sure everything was perfect. Meanwhile, they sat comfortably in their apartment, waiting for the house to be ready. I didn't complain. They were my parents, and helping them was just the thing to do. In return, I had asked for only one thing: occasional babysitting. Not every day, not even every weekend, just when I needed it. My wife had passed away a few years ago, and I was doing my best to raise my children on my own. But sometimes I needed help. I thought it made sense, and they had always agreed, until that night. We were in the middle of dinner when my dad put down his fork and said, "We're not going to babysit your kids anymore." At first, I thought he was joking, but his face was serious. The table went quiet. Then he continued, saying they were tired, that my children were too much. And then came the worst part. He compared them to my sister's children, saying how well-behaved they were, how quiet, how easy, unlike mine. I looked over at my sister, who didn't say a word, just sitting there smiling. Something inside me twisted. I had spent 2 months fixing up their house for free. They had never had to lift a finger, and now they were telling me that my children, were some kind of burden to them, that they weren't good enough compared to my sisters. I took a deep breath, trying to keep it together. Then I said, "Really? Then I'll stop fixing your house." Silence. My dad just stared at me, as if I had slapped him. My mom jumped in, trying to smooth things over, saying I didn't understand how hard it was for them, how they had done so much for me. She made it sound like I was forcing them to do unpaid work when, in fact, I had hardly asked them for anything. Before I could respond, some of our other relatives spoke up. They didn't like it. One of my aunts said it was ridiculous to talk about my children like that, especially in front of them. Another uncle pointed out how much I had already done for my parents, how I had basically saved them thousands of dollars in repairs. My sister, still silent, just soaked up the praise for her perfect kids. I stood up. "Thank you for a great Thanksgiving dinner," I said. "I'm really thankful for everything." Then I turned to my children and told them we were leaving. We grabbed our coats and walked to the car, leaving a table full of stunned faces. That night, my children asked me why their grandparents had said those things, why they kept comparing them to their cousins. I sighed, rubbing my face. The world isn't always fair, and sometimes grandparents aren't the nicest people. They looked at me, waiting for something more. So I made sure to say the most important thing, "But I love you both more than anything." I went to bed exhausted. I had no regrets, but it still hurt. The next morning, I woke up to 52 missed calls from my parents. When I saw that many, my first thought was that something terrible had happened. My stomach sank. I immediately called my mom back, half expecting to hear about some kind of emergency. Instead, the second she picked up, she started talking as if I had personally set her house on fire. "John, you need to come over now." I frowned. "Why? What happened?" She dodged the question, just kept insisting I come over. My dad got on the phone, too, his tone tense but controlled. "Just come, John. We need to talk." I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what this was about. But I also knew I had to go anyway. My kids still had some things at their place, and I didn't want to leave their stuff behind. So I told them I'd be there in an hour. When I walked into their apartment, I could immediately tell that things had not calmed down overnight. My mom was pacing. My dad was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed. And my sister, who had apparently decided to get even more involved, was sitting on the couch like she was moderating a presidential debate. As soon as I closed the door behind me, it started. My mom jumped in first. "John, don't you think you overreacted?" I stared at her. "Overreacted?" My dad jumped in. "Look, we're sorry if we hurt your feelings, but you can't just refuse to finish the house because of this." I almost laughed. There it was. That was what this was really about, not the family, not the kids, just the house. I shook my head. So let me get this straight. You call my kids a burden, say they're too much for you, compare them to my sister's kids in front of everyone, and now when I say I won't do the work you asked me to do for free, and the problems? My mom put her hand to her chest, as if I had just deeply offended her. That's not fair, John. We've done a lot for you. We took care of your kids for years. My sister finally spoke up. Mom, Dad, you really shouldn't compare the kids like that. For the first time, my parents looked surprised. My mom blinked at her. You don't think we were right? My sister shrugged. It's not about being right. You just shouldn't have said it in front of the kids. It's not okay. I have to admit, I didn't expect her to say that. She wasn't exactly defending me, but she wasn't taking their side, either. But instead of backing down, my dad turned back to me. John, we just want this to be over. You're not going to cut us off over something so small. I looked him dead in the eye. Watch me. My mom gasped, like I had threatened to put her in a nursing home. My dad started to say something else, but I was done. I went to the closet, grabbed my kids' clothes, and headed for the door. And that's when my mom said it. John, you're being selfish. I stopped. Selfish? After 2 months of free labor? After bending over backwards to help you? After never complaining about all the times you needed something from me? You want me to work on your house, but you won't even look after your own grandchildren? You want my time, my effort, my energy, but the second I need something, it's suddenly too much for you? My mother opened her mouth to respond, but I was done. You don't have to babysit anymore, but I don't have to fix your house either. Then I walked out. That was just the beginning. Things got worse over the next few weeks. First, they tried to make me come back. Then they tried to guilt me. Then they begged because now they had a real problem. Hiring professionals would cost them a fortune, and the more I ignored them, the more desperate they became. But then, just when I thought they couldn't get any more manipulative, something else happened that changed everything. For the first few days after that fight, I ignored their calls. They texted and I ignored those, too. Then came the guilt tripping. First, my mom tried the classic, "We're getting old, John. We won't be around forever," speech. Then my dad sent me a long message about family loyalty and how I was being unreasonable over a small misunderstanding. Meanwhile, my sister stayed mostly quiet. I figured she was trying to stay out of it, but at least she had spoken up a little during the argument. Then, about a week after Thanksgiving, I got a message from my dad that actually made me laugh. John, we forgive you. Can you come finish the house this weekend? Forgive me? I didn't even reply. That's when they shifted strategies. At first, they tried bribing me. My mom called and said they'd start babysitting again if I finished the house. I told her no. Then my dad texted me, saying they'd consider helping with the kids if I came over to talk things out. I told him no. Then they sent my sister to try. She called me one night, starting with small talk about the kids, then casually said, maybe you should just finish the house. They're being stubborn, but it's probably easier if you just get it done. I laughed. So I do free labor, and in return, they insult my kids, and you think I'm the one who should back down? She hesitated. I mean, it's their house, John. They're just stuck in their ways. You know how they are. I do. That's why I'm not doing it. She sighed. Look, I get it, okay? But they're never going to admit they were wrong. They're our parents. That hit me. She knew they were wrong. She wasn't even trying to deny it, but she also knew they would never say out loud. I told her I had to go, and hung up. That night, I thought about everything. How for years, I had been doing things for them without asking for anything in return. How they had never once shown me real appreciation. How they acted like it was my duty to help them, but an inconvenience to help me. And I decided I was done. Completely. That was the night I blocked their numbers. 2 days later, my sister showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door and saw her standing there, looking uncomfortable.
We need to talk, she said.
I let her in. She sat down at my kitchen table and just stared at me for a minute, then sighed. They called a contractor. That surprised me.
Good.
So they finally got someone to do it. She winced. Yeah, but there's a problem. I waited. They got scammed. I blinked. What? She nodded. Dad hired some guy off Facebook because he was cheaper than a real company. Paid him up front, and now he's gone. Took the money and disappeared. I couldn't help it. I laughed. My sister gave me a look. John, they lost $10,000. I stopped laughing. 10 grand? Wait, where did they even get that much money?
They borrowed some of it, she said.
From family. That part caught me off guard.
Who?
She hesitated. Uncle Mark, Aunt Linda, even Grandma. I sat back. They had borrowed from multiple people just to avoid admitting they needed me, and now they were $10,000 in the hole with a half-finished house. I shook my head. That's not my problem. My sister nodded slowly. I know. And I told them that. That made me pause. You what? She sighed. I told them they should have just apologized to you. That they did this to themselves. For the first time in this whole mess, I felt something shift. My sister, their favorite, their golden child, had actually stood up for me. She leaned forward. John, they're desperate. They want you to come back. They're still being stubborn, but they know they messed up. I crossed my arms. And you think I should make them beg? She shrugged.
Yeah.
Hearing my sister say that threw me off. She had always been the favorite, the one they praised, the one they defended. And now she was telling me to make them beg? I raised an eyebrow. You really think they'll do that? She gave me a half smile.
They don't have a choice.
For the first time in forever, I felt like I had the upper hand. I leaned back in my chair. So, what exactly do they want from me? She sighed. They want you to come over and talk. I laughed. Yeah, I've heard that before. She nodded. I know, but this time, they're not in control. You are. And she was right.
I didn't go that day.
I didn't go the next day either. I let them sit in their mess. Let them sweat. A few days later, my mom broke. She sent a long, rambling text, half apology, half excuse. She admitted that maybe they were unfair, that maybe they shouldn't have said what they said, but the funniest part? She ended it with, we should have handled things differently, but you also overreacted. I actually laughed when I read it. Even when they were desperate, they still had to throw in some blame. I ignored the message. Then my dad tried. His was shorter. John, we need you to come back and finish the house. We'll figure everything else out later. No apology. Just, we need you. Ignored. The next night, my sister called me. Okay, she said, I think they're actually breaking this time. What happened? They told me to tell you they're sorry. I blinked. Wait, they actually said that. She hesitated. Well, not in those exact words, but... I sighed. Close enough. Then she said something that surprised me. They asked me if I thought you'd ever speak to them again. That made me pause. For the first time, I realized they were actually scared. They weren't just worried about the house. They were worried they had pushed me too far. And honestly, they had. I agreed to meet them, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to hear it from them. I told my sister I'd come over, but on my terms. When I walked into their apartment, they looked different, less sure of themselves, more nervous. My mom had been crying. My dad looked exhausted. I sat down, crossed my arms, and waited.
Finally, my dad sighed.
We messed up, John. That was the closest to an actual apology I was going to get. He went on about how they didn't mean to hurt me, that they were frustrated, tired, stressed, that the house had become overwhelming, that they had said things they shouldn't have. Then my mom finally spoke, her voice quiet. We love you, and we love the kids. And for the first time, I believed her. I let them sit in the silence for a moment, then I said, I'm not finishing your house. My mom gasped, like I had slapped her. My dad tensed. John, he started, but I cut him off. You don't get to insult my kids, and then expect me to come running when you've done everything wrong. They didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. But it was done. After everything they said, after all the hurtful things they'd done, I wasn't going to fix it for them this time. And I wouldn't again.